Test, 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 test.
If I may have everyone's attention, please. My name is Ed Whitfield, and this represents the second day of what we call a forum relating to the Clean Air Act. And we have a distinguished panel of witnesses with us today, as we did on Tuesday. And I would hello. Oh, okay. Mr. Herrera, how are you?
Sorry.
Good to see you. I knew if I started talking, everybody would start coming in. So. But as I said on Tuesday, the only purpose we have in these forums is that really since 1990, there's really not been much of a public discussion about the Clean Air Act. We all, and I think all the witnesses on Tuesday, and I'm sure today, will acknowledge that the Clean Air Act has been tremendously beneficial to our country. And the purpose of the forum is simply to give us, members of Congress, an opportunity to listen to those people who have the responsibility of implementing and enforcing and developing these environmental laws, particularly as it relates to the Clean Air Act. And so today, we're not going to have any opening statements from members of Congress. As I said, the purpose is to listen. And so we're going to give every one of our witnesses an opportunity today to make a statement. And it's our hope that everyone participating here at the front table, for lack of a better description, would feel free to make any comments they might want to make, any questions that they may have for other witnesses. And then, of course, members of Congress we'll be asking a few questions as we go along as well. But with that, I know Mr. O'Mara has been delayed a little bit. He's on a train, and we do expect that he will be here soon. But I'm going ahead and introduce our panelists that we have with us this afternoon. First, we have Mr. Henry Darwin, who is the director of the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. We appreciate your being here, Mr. Darwin. We have Mr. Steve Herrera, Sr., who's the executive officer of the Southern Ute Indian tribe. We appreciate him being here. We have Susanna Hildenbrand, who is the chief engineer for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And we have, well, I'll introduce Mr. O'Mara when he gets here, but we have John Paul, who is the administrator for the Regional Air Pollution Control Agency from Dayton, Ohio. Thank you, Mr. Paul. And then we have Mr. Barry Wallerstein, and he's the executive officer of the South Coast Air Quality Management District in California. And he was born in my district. That's not the reason he's here, because I didn't know that until just a few minutes ago. But we're delighted that he's here as well. And I will just say, that, Mr. O'Mara, that he, as I told you, he's on the train. He'll be here soon. He's the Secretary of the Environment and Energy for the state of Delaware. And I've already been told by some people in his office that he's on his way. So once again, I want to, and welcome to all of you in the audience as well. We appreciate your being here. And Mr. Lee Terry is with us today from the state of Nebraska. He's a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Clean Air Act. We also have Mr. Pete Olson from Texas, who is on the Energy and Commerce Committee and has jurisdiction over the Clean Air Act. And we have Mr. Tipton from Colorado. and we appreciate him joining us this afternoon very much as well. So with that, why don't we go on and give you all an opportunity to give your opening statement, for lack of a better term. And Ms. Hildebrand, why don't we just start with you? You're recognized for as much time as you need, as long as it's not too much, for your opening statement.
Sure, I'll try not to talk too long. First, thank you so much for holding this opportunity.
I just want to interrupt one more time and just say this. When we asked these witnesses to come, as I said, all of them have a lot of experience with the Clean Air Act, and we wanted them to simply give us their impressions of the experiences they've had, what's working, what's not working, any particular problems. So it's totally up to them to convey whatever they want to convey. So thank you.
So I've submitted a number of comments, and really just in case I didn't get an opportunity to highlight something, I tried to put it in the written. So as far as my opening remarks go, what I'd like to say, it's no secret that Texas has taken issue with a number of some of EPA's interpretations of the Clean Air Act, but it isn't always just the interpretation that leads to that disagreement. And I think, and I've said this to a number of people, in reviewing some of the remarks from other areas, I think there are a lot of similar remarks that people have made where we may not come from the same place, but we're observing the same problems in certain areas. When I describe the air quality process to someone who's not familiar with the Clean Air Act, I always say that there are things we do to improve air quality, and there are things we do to comply with the Clean Air Act. And sometimes they intersect. They qualify as both attempting to clean air quality, improve air quality, and satisfying the Clean Air Act. But there are things over here that could be referred to as checking the box exercises that have no benefit to air quality, but yet the state is held responsible for them. And I think that's where the biggest opportunity for improvement is, where something has become a regulatory drain, but without quantifiable or limited benefit. I think those are the opportunities that could result in a great improvement. Texas, of course, has been very vocal because we have a large industrial economy. It supports a lot of the rest of the nation with some 28%, 27% of the refined gasoline or refineries accounted for, 27% of the U.S. total. 28% of the marketed natural gas production occurs in Texas. There are over 400 chemical plants and refineries along the Texas Gulf Coast, and they represent the largest petrochemical complex in the world, employing 33,000 Texans. So it's a big part of the Texas engine that is affected by the Clean Air Act, and part of the reason we get so involved. We really believe that you can protect the environment and that you can have a growing economy. But there are things in the Clean Air Act that could be improved to help us do that better. And that's pretty much my starting point, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Paul, would you like to give your comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm especially happy to hear your opening statement with regard to the effectiveness of the Clean Air Act. That's certainly something we would agree with, and that's a great place to start. That's a great place to start, a recognition of the effectiveness of the Clean Air Act. I've worked for the Regional Air Pollution Control Agency, the local agency in Dayton, Ohio, for 40 years. I started there in 1973. I actually did an internship in 1972. The Regional Air Pollution Control Agency, RAPCA, is one of 9 local agencies in Ohio. And it's actually a good example of one of the topics that you suggested, the relationship between the federal government, the state, and the locals. I love working for a local agency. I like the fact that maybe I sit in church next to the plant manager of a plant that I'm inspecting, and I think from the local agency perspective to work and worship with the people that you regulate really gives a good perspective. You recognize both the importance of clean air and the importance of jobs and the importance of permits and the importance of working together and cooperating. RAPCA is a member of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. That has given us a tremendous opportunity over 30 years of working with other state and local agencies, of working with national associations that represent both environmental groups and industry, and so over the years we've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with others and to examine common problems and ideas and work toward solutions, and I think that it's proved to be a model that we can work together and we can tackle problems. It's just like Susanna said, that clean air and growth are things that can go together, and we've seen that over the years. We have good working relationships with environmental groups and industry. We share common goals, we share common problems, and I really want to stress the importance of working together and the fact that it can be done. I mean, we can sit down, we can recognize common goals and common problems and work out solutions. With regard to what I've learned over the 40 years that I've worked in this, there are a couple of things, and one in particular is the importance of timeliness and certainty. If we have a source that comes in that wants to install a new ethanol plant in the area, we sit down and what they want to hear from us is that we're going to process their permit in a timely manner, and that it's going to be a good permit, that it's going to be one that meets the law, that they have certainty once they have that permit. What we want from them is good control technology, and in that first meeting, if we agree that they're going to put on the best available control technology, then the process works, and it works in a timely manner. You can process permits, and you can process them quickly, and you can give the assurance to the industry that it's going to be a permit that stands, and you can give assurance to the community that it's going to be an industry that operates with good controls and minimal impacts on air quality. In looking over some of the notes from the forum that you held before and looking at the topics that you discussed, there are several things that I hope we're able to emphasize today. One of those is the importance of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and that's a process that has worked. When I read, through the papers and the trade press and all that about, thinking about interjecting cost into the setting of those standards, I would urge you, Mr. Chairman, to resist putting costs in the setting of the standards. It goes back to this issue of certainty, and the public wants to know that the air quality standards, when they're set, that they are protective of public health. And I know that you're hearing from some people that the standards, that the cost of meeting those standards is becoming, is increasing. That's a separate topic, and you can separate the topic of implementation with the setting of standards. And so I would really urge that when you consider legislation, that the standard setting process remains.
But Paul, on that point, Mr. Paul?
Yes, sir.
On that point, but when you get to implementation, I know at California, one of the big successes we've had is avoiding implementation strategies that did not have the cost effectiveness of alternatives. So we kind of changed that. I think what you're saying is separate the cost of the category of the pollutant, as opposed to focusing on, but that doesn't mean abandon the most cost-effective implementation strategies.
Correct. But my main concern is that the costs would be considered in the setting of the standards themselves, and the public would think that a standard is protective of public health when it's not. So that's my main concern there. Two other things: the importance of national controls. One thing that we do depend upon as a local government are national controls of electric generating units, national controls on automobiles, national controls on fuels. Those are important to us, and obviously we can't set a fuel standard in Dayton, Ohio. We can't pass a regulation which controls electric generating units upwind of us. So we're dependent upon those from the federal government. And with regarding to EGUs, I've spent a lot of time working on those, especially with New Source Review. And we have an electric generating fleet in the United States that's aged. I mean, we have in the Dayton area, we have coal-fired EGUs that were built in the 40s, and obviously something needs to be done with them. And there's a lot of wringing of hands over them shutting down, but they either have to be modernized and controlled, or they do have to be shut down, and that needs to be coordinated closely. But when we first started in the business, the anticipated lifetime of an electric generating unit was 35 years, and so for some of these to be operating 50 and 60 years, it really demands that they be addressed. I understand that you're hearing a lot about SIPs and the problems with SIPs. I would just say that there's a very good working group right now. It's composed of members of NACA, the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, and ECOS, the Environmental Commissioners of States. And if I were you, Mr. Chairman, I would engage them, and I would ask them for the kind of recommendations that they would have. I do think that there are solutions within the current system. If there's a need to address the state implementation process in the Act, then I would call upon them for exactly what precise adjustments they would have. They would be a very valuable resource for you. Two other issues, and I'll finish. First one is with regard to funding. One of the great advantages of a local agency is that we have federal funding, we have state funding, and then we have local funding. And so, for instance, at my agency in Dayton, we've had as much as a third of our budget in the past is local funds. So that gives us the ability to have more people to process permits, to have more people to do public hearings and engage the public. But with the dwindling federal resources, we've had to do more of the required work with that local funding. So funding is an issue, and I would hope that, that you would be able to address that. Also, whereas there are certainly going to be a lot of differing opinions on what should be done with regard to climate change, that is an issue that if I were you, I would ask people, and I would get some definite recommendations with regard to climate change. I think that EPA. I realize that EPA gets a lot of criticism today, but this is I've worked for 40 years. This is one of the best EPAs that I've ever worked with. They are very responsive. They are very conscious, and they work very hard at solving problems. They're very approachable. Janet McCabe, who's one of the assistant directors, used to be the director in Indiana, just across from Ohio. Gina McCarthy also came, from a state agency, and Lisa Jackson came from a state agency. So these are people that understand, the problems that we're facing, and we find them extremely good to work with, very trustworthy. Pardon?
We've had the opposite.
Well, I can only speak for myself, and we have just found them very good to work with. Last week, I'll close with this. Last week, a week from maybe even this very moment, I was in Yellowstone Park, and we went out through the entrance that comes in through Gardner. That's the one with the big arch there, and I love this. There were several plaques on the arch, and one of them said, "Created by an act of Congress, March 1st, 1872," and another one said, "For the benefit and enjoyment of the people." And I mean, it's a great opportunity to have legislation or a park or something that you can take pride in, that you originated, that was created by an act of Congress and for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And I would say that you have a great opportunity in front of you. So thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Paul, thank you for your comments, and I'm going to ask you one question because you referred to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and on Tuesday, the participants from the state of Indiana, South Carolina, and Arkansas, all of them mentioned, and even the gentleman from New Hampshire, while without giving a specific time period, all of them raised the question of whether or not the mandatory revisiting of the ambient air quality standards should be longer than 5 years. And do you have any opinion on that at all? They were talking about the complexity of meeting new requirements every 5 years, and you brought it up, but I was just curious, have you ever given any thought to that?
Well, I like the current process. In the past, 5 years. 5 years? Yes. In the past, 5 years meant 10 years. So, I mean, it has stretched out before. So I'd be real concerned if it were changed to 10 years and it became 15 years. 5 years is,
when you say it becomes 10 years, what do you mean by that?
Well,
Nobody can get it done in 5 years or it's moving.
right.
Well, doesn't that give you an argument that it shows that it's unreasonable level, that 10 years would be a more reasonable, because you can get the process done, you can actually set a standard, and you actually implement it in 10 years. I think you'd admit that we haven't been able to do it across this country in 5, so the 5 seems to be an arbitrarily short. Might have been great when we first did the act, but just like you said, it gets extended anyways because of practical application.
Sure, and I understand that, and the, timeliness and certainty are issues that I've seen over 40 years, and I would want to start with the certainty. Are you going to set the standards based on the science? Are you going to set them at levels that are protective of public health? Are you going to have the ability to address those in a timely fashion? And then, if we agreed on that, then we could talk about time.
Would Ms. Hildebrand or Mr. O'Mara or Mr. Wallerstein or Mr. Darwin or Mr. Herrera, would you have any comment on that topic?
Actually, the problem with setting the standards every 5 years or every 7 years is that implementation becomes an issue. That as soon as we get a handle on and start developing SIPs to meet those standards, we're struggling with meeting those standards and figuring out plans to meet those standards, we're already talking about having to plan for a new standard. So we hardly get a chance to catch our breath, no pun intended, on these issues before we start seeing a new standard being developed. And the way the science has progressed, and that we really do need 10 years at times in order to fully vet and fully understand whether or not a standard that's being set is appropriate, whether or not you're talking about whether it's achievable, whether or not it's practical, whether or not it is truly protective of public health. Merely ratcheting down the standards because we can ratchet down the standards, it shouldn't be our objective. We should really be making sure that we're ratcheting down because they are necessary to protect public health. The fact of the matter is that we can all agree that no pollution is a good thing. So we could set all of the standards at 0, and that would be protective of public health. But that can't be, and is not the only consideration in setting these standards.
Well, I guess an example that was brought up yesterday or day before yesterday by somebody from the southeast was that the VOCs, they can eliminate all man-made emissions, and they're still stuck with this stupid problem with having so many
VOCs.
VOCs coming off the trees. Or do they go down and eliminate all pulp harvest, and that ends up creating some more? I mean, there's some of these standards that none of us meant it to be in a situation that you would have to try to transform the entire world. I know that, in fact, we can talk, Barry will tell you about, Owens Valley and all the problems we have there with PM10. And you've got, the fact is, they'll say, well, because LA took the water out of the Owens Valley, they're liable for the dust storms that might come out of this valley. But then what happens if the Salton Sea, which was a man-made flood, that stopped the same thing from happening in Salton Sea? If we allow the Salton Sea to dry out, who's liable for that PM10 problem? So a lot of these ambient things is just trying to make reality reflected of what is possible under real experience. That is why, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you have these meetings. I want to just say, first of all, everybody here, some people think that this is a bad idea and think there's something political about this. I think it should be a standard that not only is set by Congress. I think everybody who's in the districts should be demanding of their legislators that you have the ability to have this dialogue with us periodically. And I think it's kind of exciting to do that. And I say that as a former regulator myself.
Barry, you were getting ready to make a comment?
Yeah, if I could make just a couple of comments. And Congressman Bilbray served on the California Air Resources Board, so we've had a lot of opportunity over the years to
Barry, he's a big ethanol guy, so you know how much he loves me.
We're actually tired of hearing about that.
Congressman Bilbray was right earlier when he talked about a wall between the standard setting process and the implementation process in terms of standard setting being health-based, implementation fully considering the economics as we proceed to develop our control strategies. Relative to this issue on national ambient air quality standards, do you review them every 5 years or 10 years? To me, that's not the key issue. It's the impact that political considerations are having on the actual standard setting. The technical advisors to US EPA have been providing US EPA with a range of acceptable standards. EPA has been tending to select the highest level in the range. And then as time goes by for a few years, there are additional health studies that are more refined based on the earlier work, that when one reviews those studies, one sees that in fact a lower level is called for. And if we had picked somewhere in the middle of the range or the lower end of the range, then in effect you would have had a 10-year standard. I think it's also important for us to think of the march or the run like a marathon towards clean air. And what we do today makes progress. Every day we clean the air is cleaner air for people to breathe, fewer health effects. And in our region, we're headed down a path. And for us, we want to know what the ultimate goals are in the past, or in the path, and what the long-term game plan is, because we can invest more wisely in the controls. We don't have lost or sunken control costs because we somehow need to move in a different direction. So for us, having the review every 5 years, having it strictly health-based is the proper way to do it.
Mr. Herrera, did you have a comment on that? You don't have to.
No, not at this time, thank you.
I'd like to.
Thank you very much for that.
I'd like to jump in. With regard to the standards, we do think a longer time frame would be appropriate. And when EPA has not been pressured by a litigation date, it has taken approximately 10 years. What we see happening with a 5-year cycle is two things. Number one, EPA uses the same studies they used for the last one. So the science doesn't significantly change. They use the same set of data. For an EPI study, you take a cohort of people and you follow them through time, and you ask yourself, how has their health changed since the last time you visited them scientifically? And so when you set these standards so close to each other, EPA turns around and is doing the same, using the same information to come up with perhaps a different result depending on who they have advising them or whatever. So our toxicologists really believe that a 10-year look would be more appropriate. Secondarily, when EPA is pressed to pop these standards out, what ends up happening is that they pull together all of this massive amount of scientific information, throw it out for public comment, and you've got like 1,000 pages of significant, dense scientific information that the states have 60 days to review and comment on. And so if you had a longer time frame, then perhaps we could have more of a conversation about where you set them. We often see that EPA picks these certain studies that support where they seem to already have an impression of where they want to go, and perhaps ignore some of the other studies. Well, if you had more time to comment, if you had more of a conversation, then perhaps you could talk about the other studies that weren't present in the 1,000 pages that they put on the docket.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being a few minutes late, but I do think I made it faster from Union Station to this building than anybody in the history of the without assistance. I do think it's a good conversation, because right now, I mean, our state is struggling trying to figure out how to implement the recently adopted 2008 NAAQS standard for ozone, which is set at kind of an unhealthy level of 75 parts per billion after after delays from different administrations and different court cases. I think the part that we struggle with is that without the NAAQS being kind of the foundational kind of number that you're shooting for and having some predictability about when that's going to come out, everything else that's delayed is delayed as a result of it. I mean, right now, many of our states are engaged in litigation over the cross-state rule, but we're fighting over the 1997 standard, not over the 2008 standard, or what we were hoping was going to be a 2011 standard, or 2012. And so the problems that these things aren't lining up. But one of the keys, and I think the bedrock and the reason the Clean Air Act has been so successful over the years, is that you do have sound science as the basis for setting those standards. And so I think we can get into debates about timing and about making sure they're set. But I mean, the fact that we until a year ago we were operating under a 1997 standard on science that was outdated, on science that was that had been kind of disproven through different additional work. I mean, I think that puts all of us in a tough position. And so, I mean, if there is any kind of way to ensure that those standards are being set more regularly, and then kind of building on top of it, it'd be easier. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I think a lot of our companies face is that they want the predictability. The predictability is worth more to them than kind of the stringency of the standard. Because if we say, you need to meet this standard, you have 3 or 4 years to get there, they'll come up with the most cost-effective way. And I actually think that the litigation kind of on all sides of these things is adding to that lack of certainty. But I do think that there is a way to have sound science. I mean, the idea of introducing costs or other kind of politics into the setting of the standard, I think, is a dangerous precedent. We've seen these standards delayed and delayed and delayed as it is under the current regime. And then let's give more flexibility on the implementation side. Let's allow more multi-pollutant efforts. Let's allow greater streamlining. And to Mr. Paul's point, there's a great conversation going on between ECOS and NACA right now about SIP reform. And I think most of the tools are administrative. But there's a lot of things we can do to streamline the process. But I do think the NAAQS have to be sacrosanct in the process.
I want to thank you all for mentioning EGOS, because some of their representatives are here today, as a matter of fact, and they were here on Tuesday and actually helped us set both of these forums up. So thanks for mentioning them. Now, having made a comment about ambient air quality standards, you want to make any additional statements?
I'll talk quickly like I always do. I mean, I do appreciate, in Chairman Whitfield, I do appreciate the conversations. I had the privilege of testifying before you recently. I thought you had a very good session a few weeks ago on the PM 2.5 standards. I do hope that there seems, I hope we can have some consensus that there is a big difference between the way we look at the NAAQS versus the way we look at the SIP. And kind of looking, one is the sound science and making sure that clear standards that are science-based, that are kind of rigorously evaluated, and then on the SIPs looking for ways to give more flexibility to achieve those standards. We've had great success in Delaware over the past 20 years since the Act was amended. NOx has gone down by 93% in the EGU sector, and then 67% overall. I mean, massive reductions. We're at the point now where only 5 or 6% of our actual ozone that's being breathed in our state is actually coming from our state because of upwind sources. But I'll come back to that. But I do think there are opportunities to look at more cost-effective ways. I mean, right now, because the SIPs are kind of done individually, the timelines don't always line up. We are making it more expensive for folks to comply with some of these standards. One of the things that we did, and Ali Mirzak Lili's here, our air director, who's been a kind of a national leader on this, we adopted multi-pollutant regulations. And we basically said, look, these are the standards you need to hit. We're going to give you time to achieve those. You can come up with the most cost-effective way to do it. It wasn't overly prescriptive, and the controls were put in place are more cost-effective than I think my regulators would have come up with if they designed them on their own. And as a result of that, we not only hit our NOx and SOx and mercury goals, but we also hit our PM2 goals. And so we didn't have to regulate them individually. We didn't have to be overly prescriptive. And so there is that kind of flexibility built in. But I do think that we need to figure out a way to kind of line up some of the timing issues, because I can't help myself. I do have to talk about transport just for a second. We are at the point now, though, where we do need to talk about kind of air quality being a national problem. Individual states, and I'm Tom Burek, who was before you the other day from New Hampshire, they're in a similar condition where more than 90% of their air pollution is coming from upwind sources. And
Those of us in San Diego know how it feels.
Exactly. Exactly.
But when you talk about that, you're talking national. I hate to say this, and we'll get into it, what do we talk about the international aspect of it? And when you're talking mercury now, I've got to tell you as a Californian, and I'm sitting there looking at, do I shut down the operations in the Midwest for, all kinds of things, including cement, knowing that I shut it down, that the production in China will skyrocket, and China's taken all their scrubbers off, basically. Now, what's the exposure to what's the long-term exposure to California based on that strategy? So my question there is, do we ignore the international incidence of what we do here and its long-term impact on the entire strategy?
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, obviously we have one of the most rigorous mercury programs in the state, but a lot of the impacts we have are coming from other places. I guess there was an interesting conversation the other day about impacts from Mexico, and could they actually pay for controls in Mexico and get credit for that? And it's kind of an interesting question. I mean, I think some of these come back to trade questions, and kind of practices and things like that. And so I agree with you that we need to look at the international sources, but at the same time, I don't think the answer is to ratchet down U.S. standards, is try to figure out how to make sure we're having a level playing field globally. I mean, a neurotoxin like mercury that we know is damaging, every study shows it, is something that we really do need more of a kind of a global solution, but we need to make sure we're doing our part. And there's great efforts in many of the states that are represented before you today on mercury.
I think if you get into it, I think the doctor will point out that when it came to the oxygenate mandates and the so-called the green fuel deal, the life cycle, the total impact was we were looking at in California, where we had real problems with some of the Fed standards, because they weren't doing the entire life cycle or entire carbon footprint.
Right.
And a lot of times what appears to be a great environmental strategy short term may have some major problems. And I guess what right now, Doctor, isn't under our renewable, the only way for us to do it is that they're planning on importing the ethanol from Brazil?
I'm actually not familiar with that.
Okay, I just saw a plan, and basically saying the only way they can make it pencil and fulfill the federal mandate is to actually import from overseas. But I'm sorry.
No, and Congressman, I've talked about that before, and there's actually an effort by several of the governors right now looking for some relief with the RFS, just given that in Delaware, where corn is the way we feed our chicken, and concerns about the commodity price is a huge concern right now, because we're looking at billions of tons of fewer bushels. And so it is an area of concern. I think one of the things that we'd like to see as part of the economic part of this conversation is this issue over fairness, though, because there's a Toby Keith song that says, "I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then." And kind of looking back at 1990, there were a few things we didn't know, and one was the extent of transport. And so I wish I had known then. I guess I wish I had known then, even though I was probably about 10 years old at the time. But But it is interesting. I mean, at the time we set up the ozone transport region, extremely successful in 12 states in the District of Columbia. It's reduced emissions more than any other part of the country, with the exception of maybe California and the Pacific Northwest. But that region probably should have been twice the size it was. And the best practices that were shared, kind of the cost effectiveness tests, have really kind of shared the learning across states. So we weren't creating kind of different regulatory regimes in each of our states, some of which are fairly small. And so the industry had more predictability about best practices and standards. And now at this point, we're required to have kind of the lowest emission technology alternatives available for pretty much any plant that comes in. I mean, if I want to cite one of the cleanest combined cycle natural gas plants in the country, I need to find SIP offset credits for NOx from somewhere else. And those credits in Delaware at this point might be as much as $10,000 a credit. Now, if I was able to buy them from Indiana or Ohio, or a state that's actually probably contributing more to our air pollution, they might be $300 or $400. And so it's a factor of 10 or 20 or 30 in some cases. And so we're trying to figure out ways to, instead of having the entire focus just be on the kind of the statewide solutions, looking at the entire region. And obviously there's an attempt in that in Casper. We think that the OTC kind of approach that's equally collaborative is also an important part of that mix. And then also kind of enforcing the 110 provisions of 110A2D that has a good neighbor provisions, making sure that folks aren't contributing to other people's problems. But right now, I mean, the fact that it would cost somebody, twice as much in credits or 10, 20 times as much in credits to set up exactly what we want in this country, cleaner base load generation as it would in a state, 3 states away, it's just crazy. And so we just need a way to kind of make sure that's part of this conversation the whole time. And I know there was some debate last time about have the downwind states done enough. That's a ludicrous argument. And you look at the standards in the states that are kind of most affected by transport. And I mean, at this point, we had about 10 natural gas plants 4 or 5 years, 10 coal plants about 3 or 4 years ago. Almost all of them switched to gas. One put on $300 million worth of controls, state of the art, 90% reductions in everything. Some have actually kind of shut down because they were legacy on the margin. But it doesn't get much cleaner than that. There's nothing else that we can really do. And that story could be repeated in places like New Hampshire, Connecticut, New Jersey, and others. And the final point I would like to make is that I'd like to figure out a way to get more thinking around the multi-pollutant solutions. We've seen it to be one of the most effective, but also cost-effective, one of the most air pollution effective, but also cost-effective tools. If there's a way to integrate SIPs, if there's ways to kind of encourage folks to make investments that serve multiple purposes at the same time, and I'll actually add climate greenhouse gases into that mix too, because some of these investments, if they can be made at one time in kind of a predictable runway for how much time they need, we can get a lot done. And instead of spending millions of dollars on litigation, we can spend those dollars on actually putting people to work and then making sure these companies are more competitive. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, sir.
Do I have a comment?
Well, right now, I mean, so individual states, as they're trying to pull together their SIP requirements, they'll say, I need to adopt these 3 or 4 regulations to meet this number. If we're able to look across and I got to hit this number for sulfur dioxide, I got to hit this number for oxides and nitrogen, I got to hit this number for mercury, and then going to industry and basically saying, these are the numbers we're going to have to hit over the next 4 or 5 years. What's the best mousetrap you can come up with to hit that number? And what we find is there's a lot of types of pollution controls that actually have multiple benefits. But if you're doing them one at a time, so if I hit you with a mercury reg on Monday and then a year later I hit you with a sulfur dioxide reg, then I come back with something else, you're going to make little incremental investments, all of which cost more than the big kind of the shooting match would have cost if we did it in a smart way all at once. And it also, given the cost of capital, given the cost of labor right now, given the amount of money on the sidelines, it's unfortunate. Maybe it's the nature of the economy, but there was a time in 2009 that we had more trades folks working on kind of environmental improvement projects than we did on construction. Now, fortunately, our construction industry's picked up since then, but a lot of folks were able to put food on the table for about a year period because they're investing in these types of facilities now, which are much more competitive as we're coming out of as we're hopefully coming back into a stronger economy.
Mr. Wallerstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I am Barry Wallerstein. I'm the Executive Officer of the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Our agency is also known as the SCAQMD. Our agency is the local air pollution control planning and regulatory authority for the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, an area that is home to 16 million Americans. I've served in the role of executive officer for the last 15 years and have over 30 years experience in implementation of the Clean Air Act. Probably not a surprise to anyone in this room that historically the LA area has suffered from the nation's worst overall air pollution problem, and naturally the resulting public health effects have been very, very substantial, ranging from respiratory and cardiac disease to preterm and low birth weight babies, to increased risk of cancer, to literally losing thousands of members of our community to premature mortality in a given year. Public health improvement is our first priority, but it is accomplished through a balanced set of policies that give due consideration to economic conditions. I've submitted written responses to the pre-form questions, and what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is just emphasize a few points and to supplement those written answers with some additional information based on the forum that was held earlier this week. First, as you've been hearing, I think, from virtually everyone, Clean Air Act implementation is truly a great success story, possibly the best in the nation's environmental management and improvement efforts. In Southern California alone, many thousands of lives have been extended or saved. Now, having said that, it's also important to note, like implementation of any other 20-year-old law that encompasses literally hundreds of pages, some fine-tuning of implementation policy under existing statutory language, as well as possibly some very limited surgical amendments should be developed and potentially considered during the next few years in a bipartisan manner. Relative to the SIP process, I'd like to point out several administrative changes that would improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of Clean Air Act implementation, and you've been hearing these from other panel members as well. Specifically, alignment of SIP submittal dates for pollutants such as ozone particulates, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. There are clear interrelationships between these pollutants and their control, and they can best be addressed in more of a single coordinated SIP submittal fashion. Similarly, as you just heard, EPA should pursue a multiple pollutant approach in its rulemakings to the extent practicable, since such an approach will produce administrative efficiencies as well as cost savings for the regulated community. In addition, another needed administrative change to current policy is for the U.S. EPA to simultaneously issue new NAAQS with the associated implementation guidance. EPA should also improve in its guidance transition from one national ambient air quality standard to a newer revised national air quality standard. You've heard from others that we also need the federal government to be a more active partner in SIP implementation by further controlling pollution sources under its jurisdiction and committing to do so as part of the SIP approval process. The way the process has worked to date is the local and state entities have to commit to all the necessary emission reductions beyond existing rules and regulations that are on the books, and then we get to take credit after the fact for EPA regulations that may happen in the future. That simply means in the SIP planning process that we have to put into our plans additional control measures to make up for what would likely come from the federal sources. And as the federal clean air standards are tightened for a number of regions, such as mine, we simply can't get to the clean air standards without the federal government committing to and doing its fair share of the pollution cleanup. Like many others that come before Congress, we also have to ask for additional financial support of the state and local planning and regulatory and outreach efforts. This occurs through sections 103 and 105 and also through programs like DERA. This becomes, again, especially important as the NAAQS are reconsidered and potentially lowered. This will help us with the necessary data gathering and analysis. It's going to yield better air quality planning and control strategy development and implementation, among other aspects, and quite frankly will allow us the full use of available science, which is to everyone's best interest, the general public as well as the regulated community. In my written comments, I identify 3 sections of the Clean Air Act that may need modification over the next few years, depending upon upcoming court decisions. Specifically, Section 182D1A, pertaining to offsetting of growth in vehicle miles traveled in severe and extreme ozone non-attainment areas. Section 185, pertaining to a monetary penalty on stationary sources for failure to attain the NAAQS on time. And Section 172B9, pertaining to contingency measures for extreme non-attainment areas relying on technology advancement for attainment demonstration. The specific issues related to each of these is outlined in my written submittal, so I won't go through those. But let me also note that we are hopeful that these matters can be resolved under existing statutory language but if they can't, then our agency will be back before Congress in the future asking for action. Lastly, any major reauthorization of the Clean Air Act should also address climate change. Furthermore, it's our view that the nation needs better integration of air quality, energy, transportation, and climate change policies. Our tendency has been to create silos and do the planning in our individual silos. That simply is not the best way to approach it. The nation would clearly benefit from what I like to term a 4 for the price of 1 consolidated planning and implementation effort where appropriate. I would like to end with a quote from President George Herbert Walker Bush on the day that he introduced proposed legislation to amend the Clean Air Act. He said, "Too many Americans continue to breathe dirty air, and political paralysis has plagued further progress against air pollution. We have to break this logjam by applying more than just federal leverage. We must take advantage of the innovation, the energy, and the ingenuity of every American." Those words were spoken on June 12, 1989. As you continue to hear from those of us assembled here who work in this field, much progress has been made, but his call to work together to further improve air quality, in my view, is as true today as when he introduced the forerunner to the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act.
Thank you very much. Mr. Herrera, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's a humbling experience being here with everybody. And I hope hopefully we can all get together and find solutions to some of the issues that we have. First of all, my name is Steve Herrera. I've worked for oil and gas for about 15 years in my career. I am a former Southern Ute Tribal Council member. I'm a Tribal Council member and a Southern Ute Tribal Council member as well. At this present point, I am the executive officer for the Southern Ute Tribe. I've been appointed by the chairman to serve as the administrator of the permanent fund, which is our government side of the tribe. We believe that it is very important for us to find opportunities to cooperate and to ensure that we are sitting at the same table with not only our producers but also the governments. We have several different times where we have had a lot of success in collaboration, including the development and the implementation of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe and the State of Colorado Environmental Air Quality Commission to help with producing documents and also devising methods to have the tribe take over and be recognized as a state or treated as a state, and we can actually issue our own permits at this time. We just sat down at the table and was able to negotiate this with the state of Colorado. The Southern Ute Indian Tribe has exhibited strong business sense and expertise through good leadership and foresight of our past and our current leadership. Many of the successes is the result of the ability to understand and that in order to have success, you must be willing to sit at the table and build relationships. The tribe not only participates in active meetings and deliberations through the Southern Ute Indian Tribe and the Colorado Environmental Air Quality Commission, as I expressed earlier, but also with other organizations, including our county and our town, which is right in between, right in Indian country. Some of our problems that we have is that the reservation is checkerboard reservation, so there's a lot of varying different land base, including land that is held in trust by the federal government for the tribe, and also land that has been purchased by the tribe but is not held in trust. We also have fee land and also land that is held by the private sector. So there's a lot of different things that need to be incorporated when we talk about air quality within the Southern Ute Tribe and its in its land. As Native people, there has always been a heightened sense of responsibility to respect Mother Earth. We believe that it is necessary to ensure that the air that we breathe is clean and as possible, while at the same time providing economic benefit to our tribe. We have taken steps to take on the responsibility of managing our own Title V permitting system. We'll continue to take on more responsibility by establishing a minor source program. By doing so, the tribe believes we can ensure more responsible and meaningful reporting requirements, more oversight with a stronger presence, better service to the producers that operate on our lands, and more buy-in from industry. As I sit here and I listen to some of the comments and some of the issues, even though we're talking about an Indian reservation, I believe it's all encompassing. We have sources of pollution. We reside in the Four Corners area, so right next to us we have power generation, which has been an issue as well. And so we have sources of pollution that we don't have control over, and we also have issues regarding several different entities that we have to deal with. We have the approach and take the approach that in order for us to get to a point where we are making progress, that we must be in the same room. And I think that we have seen the benefits of that, and I would entrust that in order for us to move forward as a country, and for us all to get to a point where we are implementing these best practices or the regulations or the laws, is that we ensure that we that we have more people actually doing the monitoring. Our approach is going to be ensuring that we have better service for our industry representatives, and I guess a good example of some of the successes that we've already had in implementing our Title V permitting system is that it used to take 45 days for EPA to take a look at the permit and make a determination. We've only, I don't know how many permits we've actually received, because this is a brand new process, but we've already had a couple of these permits come in and be reviewed and looked at in 2 days. We believe that the benefits, including better cooperation, when you're at the table with the person who's regulating you and you can speak back and forth and you know who you're talking to, you're more apt to build that relationship and have a good dialogue and give and take. Many times when you have regulations and you have your state government or your federal government, a lot of times you don't know who that person is, and we feel that you've got to get down to closer to the ground level where the rubber meets the road in order to establish that relationship and ensure that you're monitoring the things that you need to monitor and not being so burdensome that it defeats the purpose. Of course, we talked about the dollar amounts that we make, and when gas was at $8, everything was fine and dandy. But now that it's at $2, some of these initiatives and things that we're pressing upon industry definitely make it a lot harder for us on the reservation. We have a limited amount of supply of natural gas, and each year we have to find other reserves in order to replace the reserves that are now depleting on the reservation. So we have to look off reservation, and just like everybody else, we're impacted by all the regulations and the technology and other things that we have to deal with. So I guess that would be about it at this point in time.
Would you expand just a little bit? You raised the issue of EPA's acknowledgement of trust responsibility over tribal lands. What were you talking about there exactly?
We have been able to take over our Title V air permitting system, and there was litigation that took around 5 years to to get through. And I would ask if there was any chance that I could have one of my staff kind of speak to that.
So who sued who in that?
There was no lawsuit. The thing that we wanted to do is, the thing that we have always wanted to do is negotiate rather than go to
But
litigation.
I thought you said litigation.
No, we try to stay out of litigation.
Oh, so you're not in litigation
No.
right now? Oh, okay.
No.
So who is it that you wanted to respond to this?
Mr. Sam Means. Or
Mr. Stemmings?
Sam.
Sam? Sam. Yeah, come on up here. We need your help.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Sam Maines. I'm an attorney for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, and the Southern Ute Indian Tribe's experience in implementing the Clean Air Act has been a positive experience. The tribe has worked cooperatively with the state of Colorado in Region 8 of the EPA. Mr. Herrera referred to the fact that because of the checkerboarded nature of the Southern Ute Indian Reservation, there was a dispute between the tribe and the state of Colorado as to who had authority to regulate non-Indian owned sources of air pollution located on non-Indian fee land within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And as you may know, that in order for the tribe to obtain a delegation of authority to become the primary regulator of air pollution on the reservation, the tribe would need to demonstrate that it had regulatory authority over the sources on the reservation, and it couldn't do that without a change in the law. So the tribe and the state got together and said, listen, we don't want to fight about this. We want to work together. We want to be partners in the regulation of air pollution on the reservation. But in order to implement that agreement, federal legislation was necessary, and that's what took 5 years, unfortunately. The federal legislation. The agreement was signed in 1999. 2004, it took till 2004 to get the necessary federal legislation. But the arrangement that was made and that was endorsed by Congress was that the tribe and the state would act as partners in the regulation of pollution on the reservation. The state's role would be to appoint through the governor. The governor could appoint 3 members of a 6-person tribal state joint environmental commission. The tribal council appoints the other 3 members. Mr. Herrera serves as one of the tribal appointees. That commission's function is twofold. First, to select the Clean Air Act programs that will apply on the reservation and to adopt the regulations for those programs. The tribe's role then is to take those regulations and incorporate them as part of an application for treatment in the same manner as a state to EPA, and then to act as the day-to-day administrator of the programs once they're appointed or once they're delegated by EPA to the tribe. And so, as mentioned by Mr. Herrera, the EPA just last March delegated authority for the tribe to administer the Title V Part 70 operating permit program on the reservation. The Joint Tribal State Commission is in the process now of developing a minor source permitting program. And in the tribe's experience of developing these program regulations, the tribe has learned a couple of things. One is that the Clean Air Act affords Indian tribes a great deal of flexibility. Unlike states, tribes aren't mandated to take on Clean Air Act programs within a certain period of time. Tribes can pick and choose which programs they want to take on. And so that's enabled the tribe to focus on those programs that are most important.
So they have more flexibility than states.
They do have more flexibility than the states.
So is that good or bad?
It's very good for the tribe. The tribe doesn't have the capability. Tribes in general don't have the same capabilities that states do
Yeah.
in terms of taking on these programs. But what we've also learned is that that there could be more flexibility in the conditions for the individual programs. For example, in the major source program, there's very little room for flexibility. But EPA has, as directed by Congress, adopted regulations that set the minimum requirements for state and tribal Title V programs. Unlike the major source program, EPA has said with the minor source program, and as allowed under the Clean Air Act, there is no requirement that the state or the tribal programs be at least as stringent as the EPA regulations. So the Environmental Commission, the Joint Tribal State Commission, has found that there's room for making those program regulations less burdensome to operators without sacrificing any environmental protection.
Sam, you've done a tremendous job. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Susan, in your comments, at the end, you alluded to some changes that you might advocate for the Clean Air Act. Would you be more specific on what you were actually talking about?
Sure. You know, in thinking about the things that I think would have the greatest effect, one thing that hasn't come up, although a number of good issues have come up from the people who have talked so far, is the gap in SIP approval. When we make a change to our plan and submit it, EPA under the Clean Air Act is supposed to tell us, yes, it's good, or no, it isn't, or fix this, or whatever in 18 months. And while we're held to that, to our timelines, and bad things start to happen to us if we don't get them, EPA may take over a program, and we haven't gotten to this point, but sanctions are also an option. Nothing bad happens to EPA if they don't. In fact, I don't know what the count is, but we have a number of SIP revisions that are just sitting. And I think one of the changes that could help with that certainty would be to basically tell EPA, if you don't approve it in 18 months, then it becomes approved. And that would force EPA to, if they have a real problem with a revision, to make some declaration about what the problem is, instead of having it sit in limbo. And in our case, we have a horrible example of a program that sat for 12 years, and then EPA came back, 15 years, and came back and told us, nope, we don't like this program, and by the way, every permit that's been issued under this program needs to be reissued. That's a big problem for our industry's certainty.
So these were permits that had been out there for 15 years?
Yes. Our federal permit program, our flexible permit program, had been written to basically allow for sources to make changes as long as they stayed under a cap, rather than enforcing an emission rate on each emission point. And as a part of that, one of the things that we negotiated with each of those permits was, if they didn't have the best available control technology installed, or had even facilities that had never gone through a permitting process, we negotiated a schedule to make emission reductions. And the more emission reductions that the plant could make, that gave them flexibility if they went beyond that to perhaps it was less cost-effective to control one boiler and more cost-effective to control another.
So was this relating to hazardous air pollutants, or was this ambient air quality?
No, these were NAAQS pollutants that we
Mr.
would...
Chairman, these were refineries and power plants. And would you mind
These
if
were
I...
what?
Refineries and power plants.
Oh, refiner, okay.
Refineries and power plants. I mean, you mind if I want to let Susanna brag a little bit here? Sure. I'm a Texan. But first of all, Susanna, thanks again for coming to D.C. Any help you need going back home with your bosses, the Executive Director Kovar and Commissioner Shaw, who are both Aggies, and I can help you out when you go back home and say, listen, guys, you're getting heavy. A Longhorn, you are tired of carrying their business up here in Washington, D.C. But she alluded to this flexible permitting process. And this, Mr. Chairman, this shows what having a cooperative EPA, a partner, can do for a state. I mean, this thing was approved by President Clinton. President Bush, so it was in effect for, what, 17 years. Is that right?
since '94.
And Susanna, could you give us some of the details about what this did for our state compared to the national average? It's astounding, because we did this. You realize our air got much, much cleaner while we were the fastest growing state in the union. That doesn't happen. One thing I also like to talk about is the former EPA Region 6 administrator, who stiffed you twice, Mr. Chairman. He came, you remember that field hearing in Houston? He couldn't come to it. We found out after the hearing, he was a block away. Couldn't walk across the street. Gina McCarthy had to come down from here. And then up here in Washington, last month, he was supposed to come up the night before, said I can't come. We found out he's across the street getting hired up here. Again, that just shows how uncooperative that regional administrator was and how the region became under this administration. I want to ask you, Susanna, talk about the new guy. Any changes there? I mean, is he returning your phone calls,
Yeah,
coming
I
out
believe
and
that
meeting
we've
with
even
you?
had meetings with him. It's which is unfortunate that there came a point in time when I think that he wouldn't even have face-to-face meetings with the leadership of our agency. But one of the things that kind of came about during that time was we had multiple meetings with EPA when they said, we don't like your flexible permit program, attempting to resolve the issues. And I recall that Chairman Shaw said, okay, well, tell me what is the legal issue? We don't like it. That was basically the response. So you alluded to the emission reductions that we've made in the Houston-Galveston area, which is what we're talking about. Industrial sources made an 80% cut in NOx. I mean, just tremendous.
Were you in compliance? Are you in compliance?
We are not, but we're on the edge with the 85 parts per billion. And when we look at why we're not in compliance, and I'll have to look up the specific statistic, but the dominant sources in the Houston area are no longer stationary sources. The dominant sources are mobile sources. On-road and off-road sources of emissions make up a good percentage, and I'm going to look up that number for you, but a good percentage of the NOx emissions that are culpable. Industry, I do remember that industry is holding at about 20%. So we've squeezed them as far as we can, but we don't have the ability to address mobile sources. We can incentivize fleet turnover, which Texas has spent upwards of $800 million to incentivize replacement engines and equipment, and had tremendous success under our emission reduction program, our TERP, Texas Emission Reduction Program. But we had to go there because we were left with no other way to approach the mobile sources that still have such a strong contribution.
And when, Mr. Chairman, one example how bad it was in Texas, I mean, about 5 years ago when I talked about the mobile sources, we were talking about shutting down drive-through restaurants. You could not drive through a Whataburger. I mean, that's the state, that's secession. I mean, that's out of control.
Right, so when we look back at 2002, our point source emissions were about 40% of our NOx. So about 40% of our NOx came from those stationary sources like refineries, the large industry we have there, and 55% mobile. In 2008, that had changed to 22% coming from point sources and 72% coming from mobile sources. Mm-hmm. So, you know, one of the other challenges with the form of the standard is that you're punished the more you measure. And in the Houston area, we have many monitors, more than 20 monitors looking at ozone. And all it takes is one of them to not make it. So if we have a monitor that's heavily influenced by industry, if we get those days where either the wind swirls around and picks up pollutants twice, or it just completely stagnates, then it blows the whole year.
So what is the current status on these flex permits? You can't use them anymore, correct?
That's right. You can't use them anymore.
And so what's your ongoing relationship with EPA right now? What are you all doing? What are you doing?
So what EPA told industry is that they had to deflex and get into a more traditional SIP-approved permit, and that SIP if you think about it, since they hadn't approved the SIP from 1994,
Is this an operating permit?
no, this is a new source review
Oh.
permit. So if you think about it, let's say that you were a refinery or chemical plant and you got a flexible permit. What you did was you took all of the permits, your existing permits, all of your equipment, you stuck it in one permit. Now EPA tells you that permit's not valid, you need to go back to whatever was issued under the last SIP that we approved back in '93. Okay, so all of those permits that are long gone, that may authorize equipment that's not even there, are now what EPA considers in force. And so they've been forced to go back and reestablish the individual emission rates for all of those permits. There are, as of May, there have been 69 flexible permits that have been deflexed and 42 that are still pending in-house. There's 9 flexible permit holders that have committed to EPA they're going to deflex, but they haven't done that yet.
So is that the cause of the so-called backlog of SIPs that you refer to, or?
Well, that's certainly part of them. I think that one of the problems with that SIP approval was that perhaps the regional administrator. Let me say this differently. Sometimes when a SIP revision goes to EPA, there's not enough comfort with it for them to approve it, but there's not enough discomfort. When they got to a point where they felt ready to disapprove it, they did. That there's still a number of SIP revisions that are still sitting at EPA. Why do they choose to go for one rather than another? I don't know.
And are these, is there a statutory requirement on approving these SIPs?
Yes, it's 18 months, but they don't.
18?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I could share Arizona's experience, unfortunate experience with the SIP approval process, it might help inform the discussion.
Okay.
I'm the director of ADEQ. I've been working for the agency for 15 years. And I was told when I became a DEQ staff person that EPA is our partner. And I've believed that up until very recently. I'm actually at the point now where I'm getting ready to sue the agency, sue EPA, over their failure to take action on SIPs, because that seems to be the only way that anyone can get their attention on SIPs. What happens is that the special interest groups, when EPA fails to take action on a SIP, a special interest group will choose which SIP they'd like to challenge or appeal, and they file a suit against EPA for failing to take action. Once that suit is filed, EPA refuses to speak with the states about the issue. How do I know this? We've tried it. We not only have we tried to speak to EPA about their failure to take action on one of our regional haze SIPs, we actually filed to be part of that lawsuit. We filed to be an intervener in that lawsuit. And we became an intervener in that lawsuit. So we were actually a co-defendant with EPA in the lawsuit brought by special interest groups because EPA had failed to take action on the SIP. So you'd think, wow, EPA would then have some kind of discussion. We'd be at the table as they were negotiating the settlement. They still refuse to talk to us. We were not invited to the table. We asked repeatedly to be invited to the table, and we're told repeatedly, this is between us and the plaintiffs, and we'll let you know when we reach a settlement.
Well, you know, at our hearing on Tuesday, that was brought up by the state of Florida and also the state of South Carolina. And I assume this is the regular process, that if a third party sues EPA over a SIP and it affects the state of Florida or Arizona, that EPA stops discussing the issue with the state. Is that basically correct?
It hasn't been our experience. I mean, we have a very close working relationship with them. They tend to have, kind of constant dialogue with both.
So you have constant dialogue anytime there's a lawsuit filed by.
I mean, it doesn't happen very often in our state, but there have been regional suits and things like that attacking different practices. But for them, I've never experienced a time where we weren't getting calls back on.
Maybe it's personal relationships then, because I tell you what, on Tuesday, two or three states were emphatic that they read about the consent decree or the agreement reached in the newspaper, and that EPA would not discuss anything with them. But they're not precluded from doing it because of law, but it sounds like different states.
Well, I'm not exactly sure about that, and Mr. Darwin and I are in the same EPA region, and my experience with Region 9 has been really great.
Whenever you're sued.
My relationship with Region 9 is fantastic. But this is not a Region 9 issue. This was headquarters negotiating the settlement
So-
with the plaintiffs, and my discussions with headquarters resulted in them telling me personally, we cannot invite you to these discussions. This is between us and the plaintiffs.
I suspect that the issue more is strictly a legal one, that when you're in confidential settlement discussions, that you don't have the latitude to bring an outside party into those discussions.
We were a party to the lawsuit.
So you had intervened in the
We had
lawsuit?
intervened in the lawsuit, and we were still told.
Okay, so if you've intervened in the lawsuit, then wouldn't you also have to be a party to a settlement? Otherwise,
You would think so.
You
They settled, but they entered the settlement anyway, and we were not a party to the settlement, and we challenged the settlement, and we are now appealing the settlement because we were not party to the settlement. We were not party to the discussion of the settlement, the reaching of settlement, and we did not.
I think that's something we need to explore in more detail because we're getting different experiences, different answers from different groups on that. I mean, there's no question that states are being affected, and many times in your example, you're not being, they don't talk to you about it.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that it should be essential that we clarify it, even if we have to go with legislation, that we've got to remember the big success of the implementation of the Act is that the locals are the implementing arm. They're the people that actually do it. And the feds are supervising and participating, but not actually the front line. So if you have agreements based on litigation about the implementation of a law, how do you not have the person who's on the front line at the table when you're talking about this? What it does is it breaks the whole concept of the implementation of this act, is that the fact that this is a joint effort between the local and the feds. If you cut the locals out, then it's always, oh, the locals are just here to do whatever we tell them to do. And the fact is implementation is where the big controversies always come up. So I think it's essential as the basis of this act that we clarify that you start doing legal arrangements like this, you've got to have all the players at the table. You don't cut out an essential part of this thing.
Mr. Chairman, in Texas, our problems are all regional. It's a former Region 6 administrator. I mean, right there, it's not the national EPA, it's not anybody else, it's Region 6 administrator. All Susanna and TCQ want is cooperative federalism, want a partner. And unfortunately, we couldn't get one for the first three and a half years of this administration. Sounds like we may have one now, but it was all regional. Wasn't anything outside of Region 6.
Things have improved since the region administration.
Well, I'll defer to Susanna, but I never, the former administrator, regional administrator, never turned my phone calls. I don't think he called any of us back again. He was in Houston. We had the hearing down there. Gene McCarthy flew down. He was right a block away from us. Couldn't come. He canceled out the night before he found out he's up here in D.C.
Maybe he didn't like members of Congress.
Yes. Join the club. We got to. He's a guy.
That's a not so small group.
Ed, I want to ask Mr. Paul a question, but first I just want to thank Mr. Darwin. Just ironically, I read a letter from a constituent today that asked me two questions. Do I believe in evolution, and do I think man impacts the environment? And here you are. You can answer both questions. I've been saving that.
But I won't.
I've been saving that joke ever since you got here. But Mr. Paul, you brought up something that really struck home for me in Nebraska, because we have a lot of older coal-fired plants. You talked about how yours are 60 years old. Agree that they need to be modernized. Our issue in Nebraska is that these are mostly rural. They're 100, 200 megawatts. They serve a fairly large geographical area, but a small population. And then you add in, you're only a few hundred miles away from the Powder River coal, which is cheap, and since there's more railroad tracks that go through Nebraska, the transportation of coal is easy. How have you worked out in Ohio of, in a cost-effective way, being able to shut down a 60-year-old plant but replace it with something that is more environmentally adherent to the rules without it being so costly that they just decide to wheel everything in because they can't afford to build it? Have you dealt with those issues in the state? How did you resolve those?
We have. Thank you for the question. It's a good question, and you've heard several references. You heard Mr. O'Mara talk about addressing things on a multi-pollutant level. So you would sit down with the plant. Let's look at the next 20 years. You're going to have to control for this pollutant, that pollutant, and what's the best plan going forward. You also heard, Mr. Wallerstein talk about the integration of air quality, energy, and climate change, and that's what we've done in the Dayton area. Is we have a good working relationship with utilities. So I mean, we just have informal talks. Where are you going over 20 years? Here's what we see coming down the road, air quality wise. They have a better idea, energy market and all of that. But you have this conversation, you have the goal in mind, and then you try to figure out how to get there. If they give us good controls or a plan to convert, we can give them the time.
They being the utility?
Yes. If they want the certainty. The big commodity that I think that we can work with them with is the time. And if they've got a really good plan, then we can work out a way to get.
Could they still use coal and meet the requirements?
Well, that's a part of the process. I mean, what kind of controls are we talking about? What kind of requirements are we talking about? If when we look at controls for PM fine, for SO2, for mercury. If then it becomes an economic decision for them. If it's better that they retrofit to natural gas, better that they control, or better that they replace the capacity. They need that certainty. We can give them the time, and then we work out the plan.
How do you decide the length of time?
Well,
Do you decide that? Or
well, I mean, it's going to be in the statute, but at the same time, if they've got a good integrated plan, you can work on the time.
Similar to Mr. Paul's comments, we have the regulations in place that we need, but it takes the dialogue and actually talking to industry. I mean, so many times regulators don't talk to industry, and then you wind up in some kind of litigation. There's some plants that it makes sense to put on the controls. There's other plants that make sense to fuel switch. There's some other plants that make sense to build something new. We had. I'll just give you two quick examples. One, we had one of the dirtiest power plants in the country. And we kind of walked through and we said, look, this is our multi-pollutant regulation. And there was some litigation around the regulations themselves. But, the company worked with us and said, look, it makes sense to put controls on this newest unit. It's about a 1970s or 80s unit they put controls on. The units that were, 50, 60 years old, they said, they're not getting dispatched anyway. And they're not really adding a lot to the capacity grid, the capacity of the grid. And then another unit, initially they're going to put controls, and they said, well, actually, with natural gas prices the way they are, we're going to build a plant somewhere else with that capital instead. So we're going to give us a couple of years, and we'll shut it down then, and then we'll build this gas plant so you don't lose any reliability. And so, trying to keep all those pieces together, but we can't have the conversation like this, without the microphones. But and at the same time, there's another plant they had that had, it was a small natural gas and on coal. Kind of a cogen plant, providing steam and selling electricity, and we had the negotiation where the natural gas price curve, the way it was kind of lining up, made much more sense to put on, to switch it to gas, make the whole thing cogen, much more efficient, improve reliability. In our central county in Delaware, took the dirtiest plant in the county made it one of the cleanest. But it's because we had the dialogue and there were no regulations needed to do that. They knew the targets we had to hit. They knew what we could do if we had to regulate. But it's taking a long-term view and saying, like, this is where we need to get, this is where you need to get, and let's figure out the best way to do there. And so I've been really pleasantly, I've been in the job for 3 years. We've had great dialogue with industry going facility by facility.
On Tuesday, and we've talked about this with Mr. Darwin about the litigation, the impression that I had on Tuesday was that litigation really was of concern to many local groups, state groups, and even the federal government. I mean, we talked to EPA, and they talk about the hundreds of lawsuits that they have pending at any one time. Just from your personal experiences with the local communities or state, in Delaware, Texas, what are your experiences with lawsuits and the impact that they're having?
Well, the real issue is that EPA fails to take action by the deadlines that are set under the Clean Air Act. So, you know, if I were not issuing permits quick enough, my legislature would come to me and say, you're not issuing your permits quick enough, so we're going to do this to remedy the situation. EPA doesn't have Congress telling them, you're not issuing the SIP approvals quick enough. So what's happening is they're being sued by special interest groups who decide, they are the ones that are deciding is what's most important to be worked on right now. EPA is so far behind with their SIP approvals across the country that they're only able to work on those they've been sued upon. So we've taken the prioritization of SIP approvals away from EPA and the states and put it into the hands of those groups who are picking and choosing those parts of the Clean Air Act that they want to see implemented quickly. So what's the solution to that? We could require EPA to either approve a SIP by a deadline, or if it's not approved by a deadline, then it's automatically, or disapproved by a deadline, it would automatically be approved. Boy, that would be a pretty big incentive for EPA to streamline their process. All of us...
So is this, when the lawsuit is filed by this third party, is that the example that you're giving where you, as a local regulator, are no longer consulted by EPA once a litigation is filed?
They've told us, for the reasons that were articulated, that those discussions become confidential because there is litigation.
And so
we try to remove that, that reason for not talking to us by intervening in the lawsuit by saying, okay, well, now we're a party to the lawsuit.
But that doesn't work when you intervene.
This is the only time I'm aware that a state has done this.
Right.
It did not work in our situation. They still refuse to include us in those discussions.
Okay.
So we're left with the possibility of taking a suit on our own if EPA fails to meet a deadline.
So there's a big backlog in Arizona, or
I think every state has a backlog with EPA oversight.
I think most of us who have SIP submittals have experienced at times a backlog. And in Region 9, where we're both from, the US EPA office generally contacts us and asks us for a priority listing of which SIP items we would like them to act on first. I think there has to be a very careful balancing here.
do you all do that in setting the priorities in consultation with the affected industry? Or
In part, yes. And part of the issue is simply a resource issue where EPA has limited resources and they're getting lots of submittals from all of us. I think one has to be cautious about saying that at 18 months EPA will act or something is approved, because you may promote EPA to act in a less than fully informed manner, and you may not get a result you want, or you may ultimately get more litigation, which wouldn't be helpful.
I mean, you don't, I'm not an expert in these environmental issues, but you think about 18 months, that's a pretty long time.
And some of these supervisions are not that complicated. The number that I mentioned earlier, 78.
Would y'all, I want you to go on and talk about.
Well, he has to go up and vote.
I've got to go vote, and then I'm coming back, so Brian, you all can moderate together. So,
I've been a mayor, Mr. Chairman. I can chair from anywhere.
yeah, I'm going to say moderate together because Mr. Bilbray is not shy.
That's why you asked me to be here.
So the number for Texas is 78. We have 78 SIP revisions that are pending, and 56 of them are over 18 months. And one of the problems with the current process, which ends up having lawsuits drive what SIP revisions get attention, is that that I've heard EPA make comments about vulnerability to lawsuit, and that their decision-making process is now a little bit warped by the most likely lawsuit that they're going to get, instead of what in the big picture of things, what's the most important thing for us to handle, or not being able to properly weigh all the issues, because what carries the most weight is what's going to
And
get a
so
lawsuit.
region by region, you might have different priorities, not based on what's good science, but where the tort exposure is based on what industry or what groups may be intervening.
What the regional concerns are.
The question is, Mr. Paul, how much of this backlog is caused because we're running the gauntlet every 5 years rather than maybe giving it some more time? And how much of the backlog is just the fact that the process allows this kind of delays?
I think it's a natural thing. I've worked in this for 40 years. There's always been a SIP backlog. It's always been something that's been looked at.
Well, then there's always been a problem. I think we've got to say,
there has been a problem, but I would look to this this joint NACA-ECOS work group for suggestions.
But I think if we got a backlog, then let's be, as managers, the system is not operating as originally envisioned. If it's been a consistent chronic problem, then we need to have a structural change to avoid the situation. And so we'll get in there. Let me sort of shift around to you guys and throw something out. Doctor, you've got any operating landfills in your air district today?
Yes, with a population base of 16 million, and we have a few, yes.
And I thought your SIP in 1992 said that you were going to have them all phased out and you were going to be shipping them out by train to the desert.
Well, the LA County...
With gas, I think there was supposed to be natural gas trains to do it, so it would qualify.
The Los Angeles County Sanitation District had a plan to take part of the municipal waste and to go ahead and take it out to the desert. So there is a portion of Southern California's waste that goes out to the desert region. But yes, we have a good number of active landfills.
I'm sure all of you have read their SIP and some of the stuff. You talk about brave new world and entering into new aspects. I got one question, though. In '94, at ARB, we did a whole big study. And just for the rest of you, I served 10 years at San Diego's Air District. I always point out to the chair, we were not Southern California. We're south of Southern California. But the fact is, one of the big studies was the air pollution benefits of intensification around transit centers. And it was basically looking at the benefits of land use changes. Do you, under the California Act or the Federal Act, have the ability to do any oversight with local government on either land use decisions or on traffic management?
No, and I think, Congressman, you may be aware that we're specifically prohibited in terms of dictating to local government land use patterns. However, in the last couple of years, the state legislature and governors approved and signed into law SB 375, which is specifically directed at having local governments working through their committees of governments develop plans to reduce vehicle miles traveled by developing more sustainable communities, which is the better marriage of transportation and land use patterns.
I tell you what really bugged me about that whole thing, even with AB 32, and I say this as a former mayor, that we're so quick to tell consumers to change the way they live and businesses how they operate, but we are so slow to tell government to change the way we're doing operations. And there's a big thing I'm looking at. I don't know if any of you seen the studies that have been done about traffic management, but for cities not to have to be accountable for their decisions of traffic management from the air pollution impact, I think is outrageous. I think what we're doing is saying the private sector has a standard they have to hold, but our fellow government people, we don't care. And, you know, I always scream about this town that puts a stop sign on every corner, and you know the cumulative impact on mobile sources on that, does not allow right on red, which I always chuckle about. Only Tijuana is the only city I know that does that. And the fact is that puts lights on roundabouts and then creates all of this situation for congestion because of political pressure, but never has to be accountable for the increased emissions on this. And I'm very interested at starting to shift this around under, I think it's the Johnson Act, that just as much as we require a review of general plans based on housing affordability or whatever, we should be giving the air districts the ability to take a look at traffic management and start putting pressure. And I say this as a former mayor. The toughest thing in the world is to tell a group that, no, I'm not going to put a four-way stop on every corner. Because the only people that show up for those hearings are the people who want the traffic stopped and started and could care less about a cumulative impact. Somebody needs to give them some cover, and I think under the air plans we might be able to give them cover. And in fact, California, we've got a great prototype. We've got a law that says the speed limit is legally set at what 85% of the people are traveling at and below. And so you do a speed survey, and it was to stop, speed traps. But what's great about it as a mayor or county supervisor is that when this came up and everybody wanted the speed to be set at 15 miles an hour, you say, Mrs. Jones, I'd love to have your street 15, but those son of a bitches up there at the state of California forced us to do this survey, and this is all we can do. But I'm looking at the fact that one of the big mobile source locations we haven't even addressed under the law. And isn't it time that we start asking government to pitch in and maybe modify the way we're doing? And somebody gave me, at EPA, gave me this, oh, we're worried about safety. That was the same argument to oppose the CAFE standards. Barry, you're probably old enough to remember when they said, oh, we go to small cars, people are going to be dying. But I'm just raising this issue about traffic management should be a minimum, and development patterns do matter.
Well, under the current Clean Air Act requirements, our local committee of governments does adopt a regional transportation plan, which has a series of measures. Those measures are then incorporated into the air quality management plan, the SIP, and then it becomes binding under the Clean Air Act that we meet those requirements, and we have things like conformity inventories and performance requirements. But Congressman, I would like on another occasion to sit down and talk with you about this SB 375, because in terms of local government now being more active in terms of land use patterns and transportation as relates to air quality, that particular new provision of law goes a long way, and the actions in the plans that are required to be developed are again incorporated in the regional transportation plan, then put into the SIP, and become enforceable through citizen suits.
Well, one of the things that I served on I hate to say this, I'm going to come across as a Republican Bugs and Bunny guy, but that's what they call me. I served on the California Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission has a vehicle that does it, where you set standards by the state, but then the locals are required to modify their plans to reflect those. Frankly, I see a great opportunity to do the same thing with the air districts, setting certain standards or whatever, or and then having the cities propose their general plans and bring it over for review and find consistency. In other words, the districts actually have consistency with the traffic management and the development pattern to show it. Because right now, what's happening, Mr. Paul, is that you want to eliminate a freeway or a major arterial, you just say, nope, we're not going to build it. And that city has no responsibility for the increased emissions caused by traffic going around it. If they want to block it, they want to stop traffic. If they want to put stop signs up on 10 stop signs on one street, which will destroy it as a major arterial road, they do it. And all that emissions not only goes up, but in a non-attainment area, we've got a bubble here. You allow one group to pollute more, what happens to the other group? And one of my frustrations with Republicans is they say, well, we don't want to put any mandates on. I said, yeah, you're allowing the shifting and the shifting from the public sector, creating a problem, and the private sector having to bear the burden of that. And that's one of my frustrations here. And I find the Democrats are sort of say, well, it's government, we're really looking at business. And we just got an emitter here, Mobile Source, which is one of our tough ones. LA is a good example, and we've just sort of looked the other way, and I think it was for political reasons. We don't have, we have mayors running against us for Congress. we don't have to worry about that many factory owners. Of course, recently we have because there's so many millionaires running for Congress. But let me open it. I just want to open that up just as a.
I think we would agree that the mobile source sector just needs to be looked at more comprehensively. I mean, Ms. Hildebrand said it in Texas, it's a huge issue in Delaware, and there are things that we can't regulate right now. And so, I mean, I would agree with you that traffic congestion, it needs to be part of the conversation. I mean, there are the transportation SIPs that need to kind of build in the implications, but having national measures around vehicles and fuel economy standards and fuels, as well as some of the DERA programs that help retrofit old diesel engines, things like that. I mean, there is a broader strategy, and it's been a fairly bipartisan issue, right? Because everyone wants less traffic, everyone wants cleaner vehicles, especially when they're cost effective, as they're becoming more and more so. So I see it as part of a package, but I don't think any one of those alone.
But you also have to align them in timing.
Right.
So when we end up being responsible for making an area get back into attainment, but we can have no effect on the mobile emissions, and the people who do have the effect, who have the ability to change the emission standards, who have their timing doesn't line up. So it doesn't help us. Well, that's nice that you have that mobile regulation that may have an effect down the road, but you're still going to hold our feet to the fire when we don't make it in 2 years and we don't have anything that we can cut.
Yeah, well, when I was shocked to see the studies in Kansas and Missouri showing that roundabouts were 22.6% less emitting than a traffic light. I mean, that is, when you start adding that, when you add in that something like 97% of all stop signs could be yield signs, that only those with sight distance problems, those things start adding up. I know what a huge accumulative impact. And L.A. Air Basin, the South Coast Air Basin is a good example of tweaking every little thing. I mean, when you reach the epitome of your political career when you spend 3 days on underarm deodorants at ARB. I mean, this is how picky we're getting, and here we are totally ignoring a major source just because we're looking at it. And I asked somebody like my Democratic colleagues, if you could pass a law today that would improve auto emissions 10 to 20% without making the car any more expensive, would you do it? Of course we would. I said, then why aren't you looking at what government is doing to force cars to not only emit pollution, but at a time where energy crisis and greenhouse gases is an issue, of reducing the fuel consumption too?
Mr. Congressman, our experience in Arizona has been slightly different. We actually include transportation planning as a large part of our SIPs that we're developing. We have what's called the Maricopa Association of Governments. It's made up of all the municipalities who actually get together and agree upon what measures they're willing to put in place, not only locally, but then also to include in our state implementation plan, so they're truly committing to doing it. And I had reason to, I had a transportation engineers organization ask me to speak with them just a few months ago, and I was wondering, what do I have to say to a bunch of transportation engineers? So I did some research, and I found out that a lot of the things that we have in the Phoenix metropolitan area, like right-hand turn lanes, the timing of the lights, so you're not. So I can drive from my office 5 miles north and not hit a red light if I'm driving the speed limit. That is something that we've committed to doing in our state implementation plan. That was a result of all of the municipalities in Arizona working together.
You're too young to know why it's like that, though.
It's part of our. I will say. I know it's part of our.
Barry, you remember what? Are you old enough to remember why they've changed so dramatically? Because what happened with Phoenix is they refused to allow any new freeways to be built for so long, because remember, the conservatives didn't want any eminent domain for road construction. So all at once there was no construction of proper roads. The backup got so bad, the air pollution got so horrendous that finally the voters overturned it. And that's why you notice 90% of your freeways are brand new and were built at a certain time, because it got so bad that you finally did straighten out this problem.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right, but it also shows that there is a part for transportation planning to play in the SIP development process. It's been, and it's one of those things, it's a win-win, because it's not just reducing air pollution, but it's also helping people get home quicker to their families.
I appreciate, I apologize, I just say this as somebody who's dabbled in the profession on and off. I just see this as a gaping hole in the strategy, that when we're doing so many things, like even looking at, the Chanel number 5 and the 12 metric tons of emissions in the state of California. If we're down to looking at consumer products, maybe we ought to be looking at making the car cleaner and more fuel efficient by the way government is requiring people to operate it. So I appreciate all. The chairman's heard me preach about this, but if before I leave, I hope we leave the impression that there's something we can do more to help not only clean air in this country, and help the business community, but also help with fuel costs, and that is for government to go back and take a second look at this.
Well, thanks, Brian. I'm sorry I missed that discussion on.
The chairman has heard it already, guys. Don't worry about it.
Well, we do have some more votes that will be coming up, but we do have 15 minutes or so. As we've had this discussion today, do any of you, members of the panel, have any questions for any other members of the panel? Or any comment, or any comments that you might want to just make, generally speaking, at this point?
I'll jump in.
Sure.
We've had some comments about multi-pollutants and the idea of multi-pollutant, but I'd like to connect that back to the NAAQS discussion earlier. When you think about the 6 criteria pollutants, there are pollutants that are precursors for other pollutants. And the way that EPA has approached both setting the NAAQS and SIP requirements is that they're looked at independently. So SO2 has its own standard, but it's also a precursor to PM 2.5. NO2 has its own standard, but it's also a precursor to ozone. So it seems that there are 2 comments that I want to make about that, and one is that I don't think EPA has the ability within the Clean Air Act to weigh a choice of strategies, or to perhaps delay something because you're going to get something better for this pollutant. And I think that in the grand scheme of things, that ability to connect the different pieces of the act is one of the things that's missing. So when EPA puts something out, they look at just what that silo is. And then, as you heard other members of the panel say, they just keep getting hit with multiple things that come later. So that ability to look at everything as a whole, and in order for there to be a trade-off, that means that you can't have everything all at once. The Clean Air Act is structured to expect you to get everything all at once. And the reality is that you just can't do that. So I think one of the pieces that you could look at is how would you weigh something in a grander scheme? What's more important? You certainly would not want to jeopardize local air pollution to solve a more regional, global issue that doesn't have the same effect on a nearby neighbor. So I would encourage some consideration of that concept.
Mr. Chairman, in the South Coast in recent years, we've actually been doing more comprehensive SIP amendments. For example, right now we're in the process of, we've released a draft PM 2.5 24-hour SIP, but that SIP contains elements that look at ozone. And so we're looking at how to optimize the control strategy so that what we put forward and is ultimately approved serves for both fine particulate and ozone, and does so in an integrated manner. I think it would be a mistake to say that we're going to address fine particulate pollution, but we're not going to address ozone pollution, or that we're going to put off attainment of ozone for many years because we've now decided that the particulate pollution is a problem. What we need to do is come up with a consolidated, thoughtful approach. And as was mentioned by John Paul and others, by doing that, we also help the regulated community to put into proper order its priorities and how it proceeds with its business plans on investing in control technology, so that there aren't wasted dollars or sunk resources for something that would have to change a few years later. One thing I would like to comment about is, certainly when you look at something, again, as complex as the Clean Air Act, and you think about all the 50 states and then all of us at the local level with implementation responsibilities, and our regulations either at the state level or local level, certainly you're going to find areas where various things didn't go as well as any of us would want to see or should go, and that you could say that probably in any jurisdiction. But I think as you analyze some of those hiccups, as you proceed, it's important to look at where it did go well so that you can discern what the difference was. For example, we've heard some compelling statements about a program in Texas for flexible permits. I don't know the specifics of that program, but I can share with you that in the South Coast District, we've had what we call our RECLAIM program, Regional Clean Air Incentive Program, that is a cap-and-trade program for oxides of nitrogen and sulfur oxides. The program has existed for 20 years. We give the 300 largest stationary sources, so all our refineries, power plants, chemical plants, and other large sources of those two pollutants, an allocation with a declining balance. So each year they get a new allocation, and over the years that program has reduced NOx by more than 70% and SOx by more than 60%. And it allows companies flexibilities. If it's cheap to put on controls, you can over-control and then sell your excess credits to someone who would otherwise have to experience more expensive controls. That program has terrific flexibility and has been fully approved into the SIP and has operated overall very well for 2 decades. So I think we have to tease out what the differences are that cause, in one instance, problems to occur, and in another instance, for it to be very, very successful for the business community and the breathing public.
Doctor, when you bring up those offsets and those credits too, we need to remind a lot of our colleagues that these are actually monitored emissions, documented over 365, 24 hours. These are not, projections of stuff. This is actually quantifiable emissions that we've been able to manage because we've got the science, we got the reading. Somebody after 5 o'clock shuts off their scrubber and it starts going off. The alarm's still going off in his, but we know what's actually going rather than something that is hoped for. I mean, I'll tell you something. When I was down in Central America and saw people going in and cutting contracts with teak growers based on so-called emission offsets, and it was all a scam for trees that were going over there. As somebody who worked in your field, it just set off my alarms. But these are can be documented, and obviously because of a lot of the regs and the litigation, it has to be documented to be able to be justified.
What the congressman is referring to is the business community wanted the flexibility, and the other side of the equation was better monitoring of the emissions and reporting of the emissions so that one could be certain that the credits are real, quantified, and folks are in compliance. And it was a good trade-off all the way around.
And I also assume that there was a sufficient lead time for industry to implement. I mean, they know how much they're going to be cut, and they know that, it's not a surprise that the declining cap, right? And I think that's
absolutely correct.
And that's critical to success, especially under a banking program such as that. And it's part of the reason why the acid rain program worked so well, was because industry knew what they had to comply with. They had sufficient lead time to generate those, to generate their business plans and get into compliance. When we look at some of the programs like the cross-state program, part of the real problem with that was the 6-month window that you got to make a 40% cut in that short time. So, and why was EPA driven to have that deadline 6 months out? Because of the NAAQS deadlines of when you wanted to be in compliance. So, it kind of all rolls back to everything has an effect on other things. But I do completely support and agree with cap and trade programs. We do have one in Houston on NOx. It's resulted in an 80% cut, as I said before, in NOx emissions. So when you can tell industry, this is what you have to do, this is the time frame you have to do it, and you give them sufficient lead time, they do come up with the solutions. The key is that you don't come back tomorrow and say, you know what, let's go another 10%, because another 10% after you've cut 80%, well, now that may be more difficult to accomplish, and you have to accomplish it by tomorrow. So I think those are the real keys.
Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for holding these sessions. I hope that you are getting the sense from all of us, though, is that achieving a very high level of public health outcome is possible, and it's possible at a very cost-effective way. And I mean, our senior senator Tom Carper often likes to say that the Clean Air Act, Clean Air Act didn't deliver on what was promised. They delivered twice as much and at a quarter of the cost. And so, I mean, I think keeping that kind of at the forefront, that we can have breathable air in this kind of truly clean air in this country, and there's a cheaper way to do it if we're smart about it. And and I couldn't agree more with my colleagues from both California and Texas. And I like that I was able to say both California and Texas. And it does come down to predictability. It comes down to really making sure we're clear on the outcomes. I mean, there is a piece of legislation that former Senator Voinovich, Senator Alexander, and Senator Carper were working on for a while, looking at a multi-pollutant kind of approach to kind of dealing with more of a national approach to reducing those emissions and looking at ways that are more cost-effective, more trading. We would have liked to see the NOx numbers be lower, but that's just, kind of semantic. But it was an approach that was had the potential to really kind of drive cost-effective change, and that was kind of set aside after elections and things like that. It was a couple of years ago. But I mean, I think there are good ideas out there, and I think there are models. Whether it's the work that we're doing in Delaware, there's good things going on in Maryland, and you heard from New Hampshire, and the flexibility in Texas, and we were actually the first state to have a flexible permit for an auto plant in the country, and that was replicated in many other places. But the emission reductions we saw because of that, the way that permit was structured, were fantastic, and they came up with things that our regulators wouldn't have because they're not running the plant day to day.
So you had flex permits in Delaware?
Yeah, we had a flexible permit we had the first flexible permit in the country for the auto
No love
plant.
for Texas.
And then we also had plant-wide plant-wide applicability permits as well for our refinery and a few other facilities. And but again, they had very, very strict targets that they had to hit. We held them accountable. We had good monitoring. But if they said it's cheaper to do that boiler and convert that and shut down this versus doing the other thing, as long as we get the outcome, we're happy. And so just a couple of notes. So I think it is critical that we keep the NOx science-based, because I do hope that you heard from all of us today that if you have good science-based NOx, that the technologies are there to achieve those numbers that are both technologically feasible and cost-effective. We just need to figure out a way to give companies the predictability to make those investments over time. A little more flexibility on the implementation. Have strict standards, but give flexibility about how we get there. The importance of national measures has come up for many of us today, but there are certain things that we're not allowed to regulate at the state level. And having EPA do those things, and then being able to count on those being there is important. The transport issue is obviously a huge deal for us in Delaware. And then the last thing is funding. We talked a lot about SIP delays and things like that, and part of it is because a lot of funding has been cut at both the state level and federal level just because of budget difficulties over the last several years. And so, trying to figure out how to fund these programs at a level so we can get those permits out quickly. I mean, we turn out our permits probably as quick as any state in the country, but it is a challenge. And actually, and one of the reasons I think we have a good partnership with EPA at the regional level is that we involve them in the development of a lot of, whether it's a SIP revision or our permits and things like that, so they're not surprised. And so when they get it, they know, and we typically get turnaround, in a matter of weeks.
So you start working with them right day one?
Yeah, so they're not surprised. And we have a great professional staff in Region 3, many of, kind of career staff. And, Ali's been kind of a champion in our staff, kind of the red tie right there looking away from me. But, it does come down to communication in some cases, and I think there are examples in other parts of the country where that doesn't exist. There's been a lot of turnover in environmental agencies the last few years, while the governor's office is changing and things like that. But if we can just focus on the outcome and say, look, we want to achieve these public health outcomes, but we want to do it in a way that's going to do the most to strengthen our economy at the same time, start with that premise. If we can agree on that, then we can do pretty impressive things. So there's models that are out there we can replicate.
And I always like pointing out, California has twice as clean air today than it had 30 years ago, with twice as many people. Now, it came at.
But they're still not in compliance.
Well, you should have seen it when he started. You think Delaware's got problems with upstream emissions? You ought to be downstream of those guys. But the fact is, it did come at a price. The fact is, the team effort here is California is sending 300 jobs every day to Texas. And when we talked about, remember when we were talking about building solar panels in the Bay Area, we were looking at that electricity in the Bay Area was twice as expensive as Cincinnati. and 3 times as expensive as in China. And then we wondered why the administration was backsided by how much cheaper it was to produce it there. So in China, so those things do have an impact down the line, and we just got to address that. I want to thank, Mr. Chairman, you and I came on this committee in '95. I can't remember ever having a hearing with the air districts that whole time. I mean, do you remember it?
This is a forum.
Oh, the forum. I mean, but
No, you're right. This is the first time.
it is astonishing, especially, like I said, because the way the act is built to have to be a team effort, and the ability to hear from the guys on the front line when they get in there, it's just frustrating that we haven't done this before. And I hope that both sides of the aisle take the time to think about coming down and participate in these kind of groups more often, because I think it's essential when we get into it. I got a question. What are you guys doing with San Onofre being shut down? Those peaker plants having to be open. A lot of those are old ones that you were shutting down as part of your SIP. Are we getting waivers, temporary waivers to be able to? For those of you who know, San Onofre has had to shut down, so we've got a zero-emission generator. We've got a lot of these old peaker plants, or mostly only natural gas, but now they're being allowed to run again. How do they respond to that?
Congressman, we had 2 old boilers that had been temporarily shut down in Huntington Beach. We worked cooperatively with the U.S. EPA Region 9 office, and we were able to reactivate their permits hadn't been deactivated, but we were able to have those power plants come back online for this summer. And now we continue to work with the state and U.S. EPA to ensure that the grid will be in good shape for next year as well.
So thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we have 2 minutes left on a vote, so we'll conclude this forum. But once again, I want to thank all of you, number one, for preparing the submission to the questions that we ask. We are in the process of going through all of that, and some of it we've already analyzed, looked at. Number two, thank you for coming the distance that you came. And 3, thank you for the great work that you do. And we hope to stay in touch with you, and we hope that we are going to have a few more of these forums with different areas of views on some of these issues. But with that, we'll conclude this forum, and I look forward to working with all of you, and thanks again for coming.